There we go. Thank you very much. And welcome to this Experts at Work webinar, which is for members of all three of our networks. Today we're asking, are your interviews fair for every candidate, with a subtitle of Rethinking Structure, Bias and Inclusion. And our speaker, George, has got some great copy, which I'm just going to read out because it's so relevant. This session explores how a more structured approach improves both fairness and the quality of hiring decisions. We'll look at how common interview practices can unintentionally favour confidence and communication style over capability. What an interesting point. And what that means for candidates who think or communicate differently. So, George, we have interview coach and trainer Georgina Kvassay of Interview for Success, very much a friend of the networks, helps us out with the HRD networks, thanks George, and whose 20+ years experience in recruitment, not least in KPMG, informs how she trains interviewers and managers in interviewing and coaches candidates at all levels throughout the interview process. Do let us have any questions or suggestions in the chat throughout, which I'll keep an eye on, George. We're recording the session, as you probably just heard, for our members' YouTube channel, and we'll send out the link afterwards with George's slides. George, please do get your slides up now, if that's all right by you.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. Everyone else, please put yourselves on mute for now, if you would. And George, over to you. I think you've got a very interesting question to start with, I remember.
Yes, absolutely. So thanks for that, Rich. And yeah, for those who don't know, Rich and I used to work together many moons ago at the CIPD. So I'm really grateful that he's invited me to come along and speak to you all. And yeah, the idea of, the fact that I've been on both sides of the table, so as an interview coach, but also as a trainer, it really makes me think about that question of, are interviews fair, and giving everyone a fair opportunity. I work with so many candidates that are finding interviewing so difficult, but also companies who want to hire great candidates, but sometimes are making decisions that aren't necessarily as fair as they could be. So I'm going to start with a question, as Rich said. So the first question I have is, have you ever hired somebody who interviewed brilliantly but struggled in the role? Or rejected someone who didn't interview particularly well, but might have been successful? If you want to just sort of either show a little emoji, a thumbs up, or a little wave, just to share with us your own experience, just as a Penny. So Penny said a little wave there. Thank you, Penny. Anyone else? Does that resonate with anybody? Any other thoughts? Yes, okay, a few hands up there. So, I mean, I've definitely found, there have been people who interview brilliantly, but struggle in the role. And, hiring and recruiting people is a massively difficult business decision and can have massive ramifications to your bottom line, right? So there's data that shows that around sort of 2/3 of a person's salary is what it costs to lose somebody after they've actually been hired and joined. So, you want to get the best out of your candidates, and you want to get the best possible candidates that you can. But I think the key question is, what exactly are we assessing in interviews? If the process is rewarding people's ability to interview well, rather than their ability to do the job, we don't just risk making a wrong hire, but you're also systematically disadvantaging candidates in some way or another. So it's just trying to make sure that we make this as carefully curated as we can when it comes to a process. And when I'm training interviewers to interview, a lot of people haven't been trained. It's one of the least trained management skills in business, and actually it's such a fundamental part to anything. A lot of people actually can gain a huge amount from being trained to interview, by building better client relationships, going into client meetings more prepared. So it's just quite an interesting skill to have. So what does a fair interview actually mean? And fair doesn't necessarily mean identical. And I think most organizations now have done a lot of work around DE&I, and you're learning more about the fact that, treating people equally, but actually treating people equitably is different. So being fair in an interview doesn't mean treating everyone exactly the same way, because their bar is slightly different. So it's trying to work out what that bar looks like. So a fair interview isn't asking everyone the same thing in exactly the same way. It might look fair to do that, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean it's truly fair. And expecting everyone to respond at the same pace might seem consistent in the way that you approach things, but doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing for the candidate. And a lot of people worry that by adjusting their process or by doing things slightly differently, that gives some candidates an advantage over others. So it's really about trying to change that perception, and actually how do we make sure that the fairness comes through in the interview process. So a fair interview is really knowing what it is that you want to assess. And when I'm working with interviewers, a lot of people go into an interview with a set of questions, but don't necessarily go back to what the job specification is. So taking that step back and going, actually, what is it that I need this candidate to be successful in, to be successful in the job? What do I need them to be able to demonstrate? And then being consistent in the evidence you're looking for, that helps you then to be really clear on what it is, and that structure to the interview and that consistency is really important. So you don't necessarily have to ask every single person identical questions in an identical order. Actually, if I'm testing someone's ability to work under pressure or to problem solve, I can ask different questions that still give me evidence. They don't have to necessarily be exactly the same questions and the exact same probes. And then a fair interview is relevant to the role. So you're choosing questions that are relevant to what you're looking for. So, if you're looking for someone to, work in sales, yes, you're absolutely going to want them to be really charismatic. You're going to want them to be really good at presenting and selling ideas and concepts. But if you're recruiting a research assistant, is that charisma and is that confidence and is that ability to answer questions really quickly and with great, ability to come across well, is that necessarily relevant to the role? So it's looking at it from a slightly different perspective. You want your interview to be accessible enough that people can actually demonstrate their capability. So if you're giving someone 30 seconds to answer a question, are you actually testing their ability to react very quickly under pressure, or actually are you assessing their judgment? So it's things like that. And then scoring your interview against defined criteria, so you know what you're looking for and you're scoring your candidates accordingly, really helps you then to know what good looks like and helps you then to decide, okay, this candidate is really strong in these areas but not so strong in others, therefore we can reject them. And you're really clear then on what you're rejecting on and why, rather than being a bit unsure. They thought they were okay but not necessarily perfect. So having that really clear and defensible structure makes the interview a lot more robust, and also can stand up to scrutiny if you were ever asked for a subject access request or any questions were asked on an interview. So who might traditional interviews disadvantage? And there are quite a few different people here. I interviewed a deputy head recently for a secondary school he's going to be part on the senior leadership team. And he was autistic, but didn't divulge that beforehand. But he had to really focus on the question that was being asked. So he literally wrote down every single word that was asked. Then he spent a moment reflecting and then came up with an answer. Now, I was really conscious that some people, particularly on the panel, but elsewhere, might think, oh God, this is a bit arduous, a little bit time consuming. But actually the answers were so cleverly thought through and so well put together that he was successful in getting the role. But some people might be put off by that slightly slower processing speed when you want someone to be really instant in their answers. Does that necessarily mean that they're a better candidate because they're quicker? And that sort of links in a way to kind of introverted candidates who might not be as charismatic or as vocal. In an interview, they might not be quite as confident in being very verbose or chatty, and might not build that rapport as quickly. But does that necessarily mean that they're as good or not so good at the job? Interestingly, I've worked with a lot of Chinese candidates over my career. We had a China program when I was working at KPMG, and I worked specifically with Chinese graduates for a few years. And it's really interesting how, I'm just talking specifically about them, but it could be any background. Different cultural backgrounds have different things that are acceptable. So, for example, a Chinese graduate wouldn't necessarily talk about a huge success that they'd had or an achievement, because that's seen as being very rude, and they're much more modest. So we actually had training on how to make allowances for candidates from different backgrounds. But the cultural norms are different. If someone's not used to saying something positive about themselves, that's quite hard then for you to interview if you're expecting the same kind of bar at that level. Same with career break returners. If you've got somebody coming back who hasn't necessarily got the same confidence in their answers or has had a break from being in the workplace, how are you actually giving them the same kind of opportunity? They'll have loads of transferable skills, but might struggle with thinking of examples in the moment that might not be as easy to sort of to come up with straight away. And the other one I thought was really important here, and they all are important, but this idea of insider knowledge. I was working with this amazing candidate who was from Syria, and she'd moved 3 times from Syria. She'd escaped and came to the UK, had to redo her entire degree, even though she'd done her degree in Syria. But she had no idea what an interview process looked like at a graduate level. She hadn't been involved in that whole kind of, I suppose, when you're at university or at school, there are certain things that are done to help you prepare. And she hadn't got any of that. She kind of said she felt like she was in, almost like a game show, that everyone knew something that she didn't. And how does she work out what to do? And I know part of my own work is actually around helping people to navigate the interview process. But I mean, a lot of people don't have access to that kind of support and that kind of coaching. So I think it's just making sure that when you are thinking about your interviews and you're thinking about the candidates that you are experiencing throughout the process, could you do anything differently in terms of allowing them to feel like they are being fairly treated? And, this idea around familiarity with the rules of interviewing, that's what traditional interviews tend to reward. So if you see a candidate that's coming across well, that's promoting themselves well, that's confident, that's chatty, that's charismatic, that might mean that you don't necessarily probe them as hard because you think they sound and look pretty good. I even worked with when I was doing some interview training, I was working with some tech kind of experts, and one guy goes, oh yeah, I go into an interview and I just find out what the interviewer's favourite football team is, and as long as I can get into a football conversation, the rest of the interview doesn't really matter because we'll just have a bit of banter. And I just I had my head in my hands going, oh my goodness, that's his way of interviewing. But if an interviewer plays along with that and just carries on answering questions relating to football, it did make me worry quite a lot about the state of the interview process. So really thinking about where unfairness can creep in, I think there are 4 key areas. This idea, and I've mentioned it already, but confusing confidence with competence. So quite often if someone's coming across really well, they're really engaging, you might not ask them as many questions. You might have this sort of slight bias where it's sort of an affinity to them. You feel that you're getting on quite well, therefore they must be okay. And then you could make decisions too early, so that in that same situation, someone who's really confident, you're thinking, great, this person's going to be great in a team. And you might not ask all the questions you want to ask because you think, great, I'm just confirming all the things I think about this person. On the flip side, you can make a decision too early by actually thinking someone's not very good when actually they are. So I was working with a cryptocurrency firm. They're based in Latvia, and they deal with a lot of online hiring. So they do all their hiring on Teams. And one of the CEO was in an interview with the head of HR, and he messaged her at the beginning of the interview going, how long is this going to take? I'm finding this unbearable. And she wrote back going, Georgina's taught us we've got to keep going and just give the full interview. And by kind of carrying on and working through, they actually had a fantastic candidate, but the CEO had written this candidate off within 5 minutes. And so by keeping going, by allowing them to, be probed, to ask questions, that then gave them a much better picture of the candidate. And I also find this when I'm working with interviewers, where if you've asked a quite tricky question at the beginning, like, tell me what research you've done into our organisation, if that interview question doesn't go well, you might write that candidate off going, oh, that wasn't good enough, forget about the rest. And so you might just sort of kind of go through the motions of finishing the questions, but not necessarily probe. Whereas if you ask that question at the end and you've seen a brilliant candidate answering all their questions really, really well, and then you say, well, tell me a bit about the research you've done into our organisation. If they haven't done as much as you hoped, but they've done a brilliant interview, you might think, oh, but they're still great because I think they've done all these other things. So it's even where you put the question in the interview that can actually make a difference as to how you make your decisions through the process. Stopping probing too soon is something I find a lot. So what happens is You ask a question, the candidate gives you an answer, and then you move on. And it's a bit like that STAR, when we talk about situation, task, action, result, that's sort of the prep that we tell a lot of candidates to do. You might get the surface level, this is what I did and this is how I did it. But then the probing around what was the challenge? How did you go about it? What were the reactions of the team? Who did you have to get involved? All of that stuff, that peeling that onion is what gets you the real evidence that gives you the information about whether the candidate is going to be successful in the role. And by stopping that probing too soon, it means you haven't necessarily got the full evidence and you're making a decision without the information that you really need. And then another really important one, and I don't know if you find this yourselves with hiring managers, but such a common thing is when people go, yeah, I just don't think they're going to fit into the team. But what is fit? What does that look like? Who is the right fit? And I think people quite often will hide behind this fit without actually thinking, what is it that we really want? So going back to your values, who are you as an organisation? What is important to you? Is it integrity? Is it inclusion, whatever it might be? Defining that and asking questions relating to that will allow you evidence so that when someone says, yeah, they won't fit in with the team, you can really challenge that on, well, why? What is it that they don't have and how do they not demonstrate it? But also being really clear with your interviewers in advance, what does fit look like? How does that align to who we are as an organisation? That gives them a clearer picture of what they should be looking for. So looking about what fairer interviewing can look like, knowing what good looks like before the interview. If you're recruiting a certain person into your team, who's doing really well in that role? What do they have? What skills and behaviours do they have that you want to have more of? Or actually in your team, is there more that you do need? If you've got a whole team that are brilliant at one thing or more focused on one area, is there something else you need to bring into your team that will add a huge amount of value to the business? And that consistency in your core questions of what is it that you actually want to get is great, but then following up with the probing rather than just sort of following up with the people you like or warm to is really important. So that consistent probing. And then looking at the evidence you're gathering rather than just the way they're presenting it. And you'll have all sorts of candidates, right? And actually nerves can come out in so many different ways. Nerves can come out as being over talking, can be really quiet. It could be someone who's just sort of shaking and sweating and forgetting the question, or someone who's just really overly confident, but without actually having the substance. And so really trying to understand how to kind of put a candidate at ease and giving them the opportunity to be themselves is so important in the interview. And thinking about, whether confidence and communication style are actually relevant to the role. So I had a girl, I was working with her, I just felt so sorry for her. She was autistic, but she would develop really strong tics when she was being interviewed online. She was going for a research assistant in a lab. She had all the skills and qualifications, but the minute the camera went on and she was in front of an interviewer, she fell apart. And I just felt so sorry for her because the job didn't require her to be really articulate and really buoyant and flamboyant, all those kind of things. But the interview was testing her on that. And actually, is there a way through that, which is so important? Allowing people thinking time, thinking about what adjustments you can make that are normal and accessible. And that idea about, if someone is different and presenting differently, does that mean they're less capable? Or does that mean actually that they're just coming out in a different way? And I speak to a lot of neurodivergent candidates in particular, and I'm working with them. And a lot of them say, do I share that with my interviewer? And I never really know the exact way to answer this because it's a personal preference, because a lot of employers might not look kindly on it as a fact. A lot of people might go, oh, this person's autistic, therefore they mustn't be able to, and they'll make assumptions. So I never say to a candidate, definitely do or don't share that information. I think for that particular girl, if she had shared that she would really struggle on a video interview, and actually if she could have a face-to-face interview instead, that might have been a little bit less stressful. But actually giving that kind of information to a candidate. But when I speak to my neurodivergent clients, I say to them, look at the wording. What information is that organisation sharing with you about themselves and what they value? If your interview invites and what you're expecting of them in the interview is really open and very, we accept people from all backgrounds. If there's anything at all we can do to make your interview less stressful, please let us know. It's all about really the way you communicate, and that will allow the candidate to feel less or more confident in the way that you might treat them in the process. And you might not even know you're doing or not doing that. It's such a simple thing, but it can make a massive difference. And then the shift really is to think about, rather than just what questions should I ask, actually what evidence do I need to collect? So thinking about, how do I actually gather the evidence I need to see that this person is going to be successful in the role? And this huge shift, in the recruitment sort of trends at the moment is around, skills and how do we recruit against skills? That's really important, isn't it? How do I gather my evidence so that you're able to hire against capabilities and information that they're sharing with you about their abilities, which is so important. And just as an example, I think Richard's in charge of all the questions, but I know there's been a comment around getting questions in advance. Just as a case study on John Lewis, they give the interview questions in advance to all candidates. And the reason they do that is they want to give it there to be a level playing field for all candidates. They want to reduce the anxiety that people feel at interview. They want people to be able to showcase their true potential, but they also want to stay true to their values. Now, I'm not saying everyone should do that. Everyone wants to share their interview questions, but you can still have a really robust and rigorous interview with giving candidates a little bit more to enable them to show their best selves. I know a lot of people will worry about AI and worry about scripted responses, and I know that's something that comes out a lot. And there's all sorts of, now this new technology that can, you can plug in your questions as you're being asked them, and it's giving you answers. But it's about the probing and the follow-up that will actually give you the data that you need, which is much harder to do when you're pre-scripting an AI-driven response. So here are sort of 5 key things maybe for you to take away and think about when you're doing your next interview. Are you really clear on what it is you're looking for and what you're assessing? Are you giving each candidate an opportunity to really demonstrate their capability? Are you collecting evidence that's comparable? Can you explain your decision using evidence rather than instinct? And are your criteria genuinely relevant to success in the role? And the real thing here isn't just about lowering the bar. It's not about lowering the bar at all. It's about making sure the bar is measuring the right things. So it's just making sure that you are being as fair as you can be to all candidates without it being you feeling like the process has to be compromised as a result. So we've got some questions in our discussion. Sorry, I flew through that. Hopefully I spent enough time on it all. We've got sort of 3 questions that we want to kind of put out to you if you would like to sort of think about or talk about them. If there was one thing you'd change about interviewing in your organisation tomorrow, what would that be? What behaviours do interviewers in your organisations tend to mistake for capability? And where might your current interview process unintentionally disadvantage some candidates? So I thought we'd ask, is there any questions in the chat as well, Rich? I'm not sure.
More points than questions, but as you saw, Kerry's making a point about the interview questions in advance, which is a great one. And then Habby was saying, always say add, not fit, which is a nice way of putting it, I think. George, that was great. And then I think network members can see why we invited you on with such practical expertise in this, because it's, as you said, it's really interesting. It's one of the least trained or the least trained of management skills. And no, you didn't fly through it. It was a great pace. Did you want to put the questions back up again, if I can ask them to, because then people can see. So what we thought, network members, is just see what you think of the questions, and if there's anything that you particularly like to answer or discuss, or if there's a question for George and the group, just put your hand up. It may not be so obvious on phones, I admit, but it's sort of.
What have I, Rich? Is my screen not sharing now? Am I sharing you all?
I don't know. It's,
I just changed the view so I could see everybody, but now I think I probably. Now, hang on, let me just stop sharing a sec and start sharing again. I'm so sorry.
That's right.
I think what happened was I thought I'd try and see everyone, but that didn't work. Here are the questions.
But that's always nice. That's always a lovely thing. That's fair enough. Yeah, brilliant. Well done. That was really quick. Thank you. So yes, love to hear from you, network members. Is there one question you particularly like to answer or explore, or perhaps another question for George, that you'd like to ask? Sophie, hello. How you doing?
Oh, hello. Really great presentation. Thank you so much for that. I actually don't necessarily have I need to think about these discussion points. I actually just have a question. Is just what training methodologies have you seen like make the biggest impact in terms of developing that skill? I guess beyond a training deck, is it role plays? Is it just from your experience, what have you seen have the greatest impact?
So this is in terms of training interviewers.
Yeah, and just developing that skill set ultimately.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. So yes, I know people, particularly when you're looking at the 80-20 rule about trying, or 70-20-10 rule about trying not to have face-to-face training for a whole day. It's really interesting because everyone who goes on the training that I deliver really gets a huge amount of benefit. So quite often you'll go on like I don't know, a personal effectiveness workshop, or you'll go on a communication workshop and you all leave with like these great ideas, but not actually anything that you've really gained from it. So I think you're absolutely right. The role playing is critical. And again, depending on the organization, there are different ways of doing that. So I will normally get people in threes and get somebody to observe, somebody to be an interviewer, and somebody to be the candidate. And the observer learns so much from other people. So especially if you're mixing up the kind of the backgrounds and the capabilities of the team, they learn so much from each other. That's a massive thing. Getting everyone in the room together, whether that's virtual or face to face, is great because people suddenly go, oh, I didn't realize you have the same problem I have, or the same difficulties. And I actually do a session on difficult candidates and how to handle like the over talker, or the candidate that's really nervous, or someone who's overconfident. And we do like a bit of a role play, but it's in front of the whole group, where one person's asking questions, the candidate has to kind of try and be difficult, which most people quite enjoy doing. But the minute the interviewer finds it difficult, somebody else chips in. And again, they learn so much from that ability to kind of step into each other's shoes. And if that was me, I would do this. So that learning from each other is really valuable. I do find watching videos as well to reflect and to emphasize the points can be really useful. So it's sort of it's a selection of things, but I also think you're right. The training itself is the start of the change rather than the end, if that makes sense. So quite often people will go on a training and then everything has to change, and it's actually then embedding the change in behaviours and things like writing up notes, making people accountable for what they're actually writing, the decisions that are being made. That is a process that needs to change as a result of the training. I don't think just sitting and doing the training suddenly then changes everything, because it's a behavioural shift that everyone needs to go through. Has that answered your question?
So much. That's great.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. And Hardeep, before we go to Ravi. Hello, Hardeep. How you doing?
Hi there. Thank you. Sorry, the classic mute button there. Thank you so much, Georgia. That was brilliant. Really enjoyed those insights. And I think it's always good to just have a reminder. So I'm heading up talent at exec level at Lloyds Banking Group. And we have toed and froed, like I've only been there 6 months, about do we share the interview questions? Do we not? Which levels do we do it for? But I'd be quite interested to hear what are the kind of the top 3 concerns of when you do share them. Like, people think you're going to have higher expectations of the candidate.
So I think the concerns are that candidates are just going to pre-prepare their answers, and so are we going to be able to get a decent? I always say to people, if someone comes with an answer that's sort of like all in one, that is never going to be enough. Like you want somebody to give an answer, but it's then about how do I probe further. So I think it's so there's always that concern that am I going to just get a scripted response? Someone who's literally learned verbatim what they've planned to say, but it's then about how do I challenge it and how do I push forward with that, rather than it just being accepting, yes, okay, I'm going to move on, because it's never going to be that simple. I think that's really important. It's the probing that's a real skill that needs to happen there. I think so a lot of people, particularly when you're recruiting at exec level, you want somebody to be able to think on their feet. You want somebody to be very able to, answer a question with confidence and work under pressure. So a lot of people sort of say, well, at that level, they need to be able to handle themselves really well. Otherwise, there's no point in recruiting somebody so senior. So there is always that tension, I think, between what people expect at a senior level versus someone just genuinely being nervous. I was working with a team last week, and they recruit CEOs and CFOs predominantly because they're a hedge fund, and they basically invest in organizations, and then might have to hire CEOs. And they were like, well, we expect them to be able to just work on the fly, answer any questions. So there's that expectation of what you'd want at that level, but telling people what it is you want, what you're looking for is I don't think that's going to advantage a candidate. I don't think that's going to make it easier for them. I actually think it just helps them to understand what's expected of them. So many candidates I work with, or when I'm doing my interview training, a lot of them say to me, my worst ever interview was when I was asked all these questions that had nothing to do with the job. And that's the thing, so many people just want to get to know a candidate and ask all these questions that have nothing to do with the job, but a candidate's preparing for that job. And so you want to make sure that there is a relevance to what you're asking, because it can look badly on you as an organisation, right? Because people are going to share, well, I had an awful experience here, and that's much worse than, anything that you give as a good experience to someone too. I'm not sure if I answered that enough.
No, you have. And I guess my only follow-up additional question to that would be, do you see the sharing of questions in advance? Do you see them more so at the exec level or less so?
Probably less so at exec level, but equally clearer on what is expected. And I think, to be honest, a lot of the exec level in companies, people who are hiring at that level, when I'm working with them, they just want to have a chat, and that really bothers me. So I'm trying to bring in some parameters around, okay, well, it's great, you do want a chat, but have a conversation with a purpose, and be really clear on what it is you actually want to achieve from that conversation, rather than it being a popularity contest, like who do I like the most. So that's really important as well. How do you make sure that you're ensuring your interviewers are asking questions that are going to actually give them evidence, rather than just, I could go for a beer with them, I like them. Which is where the worry always is. Thanks.
Or the football team one.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thanks, Thank you, Georgina. Super helpful.
Before I go to Ravi's question, Carrie, could I just bring you in, just because you said in the chat that you were giving out questions in advance? I just wondered if there's anything you'd like to add in terms of whether it was the pushback you'd had when you introduced it, or anything at all, really.
There wasn't pushback generally from line managers. We have quite a high level of neurodivergent colleagues, and we have quite a high level of colleagues with different lived experiences as a sort of homelessness charity. And I think and one of our values is around inclusion, and we do a lot of work around that. So I think generally line managers and the overall workforce agreed with the concept. We have over 40% of our vacancies filled internally, so that internal mobility piece for succession and promotion and even lateral transfers and just moving around is really high. There was, I suppose, a bit of reluctance at the more senior level, and we had a bit of reluctance at board level when we were doing some trustee interviews recently. But basically we sort of said, it's a policy position, and therefore we see no reason why the board, where we also welcome diversity and inclusion is important and lived experiences, why we wouldn't follow the same approach. We tweaked it very, very slightly and sort of gave a bit more of a competency overview of the particular areas we'd be covering. But it wasn't diluted very much than what we do generally. I think the AI bit is something that, we're talking about a lot from a selection point of view. Everybody's sort of using it. But if you can get, as has been said by Georgina, if you can get good interviewers, then you can sort of overcome those concerns by probing it. And we're really explicit that these are the core questions that we'll be asking. Please be prepared to be probed and for additional questions to be asked around your answers. And generally we haven't seen an increase in people needing to be exited in probation or being unsuccessful in other ways through the selection process. And as I say, the workforce really like it, and people applying as well. You know, they're quite surprised that they're going to get it and that everybody gets it, rather than just people who may declare a reasonable adjustment need, that it is for everybody. So I think it's gone down well.
Thanks, Kerry. Really interesting. Appreciate it. Which brings us very nicely onto the candidate, which is what Ravi's question is about. So, Ravi, please do come in if I miss anything, but I'll just read out what you've said in the chat. Thank you. So, Ravi's saying basically, if the panel isn't doing what George, you were saying they should do, and essentially helping you to come across in the best way, how can you do that and almost steer the interview in the way that gets the best out of you as a candidate? So, I know you train candidates, so this is very relevant, it seemed to me.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how I just managed to kind of lose what you were saying. I was concentrating on it from an interviewer perspective. So as a candidate, sorry, can you sorry?
Yeah, cool. Sorry. So Remy was saying, if the panel isn't doing what they should be, and the way you've described, i.e., not helping the candidate come across in the best way, how can you do that yourself and almost steer the interview in a way that gets the best out of you as a candidate? Is there?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
No, not at all.
Sorry, I was just had a slow moment there. I think it's really difficult because when I'm working with candidates, I'm assuming that the interviewer that's interviewing them is going to be competent, and actually there are a lot of interviewers that aren't great. And so I always say, particularly when you're asked things like, you know, how would you blah blah blah, how would you deal with a difficult colleague, how would you deal with this? Always try to steer it to, here's an example of when I've done it recently. Because then what you're doing is you're showcasing really quickly that not only are you able to give them the answer they think they want to hear, or you think they want to hear, but you're actually able to back it up with a situation where you've actually done it. And I always suggest that because I think you're right. A lot of interviewers are coming in. They might not have even read your CV. They might not have even thought about what questions they want to ask. There's so many variables, particularly when it's online and someone's rushing from one meeting to another. Sometimes they're opening their Teams at the same time as sort of looking at who the name of the candidate is, and it's awful to think, but it's a reality. And so I think, for a candidate to be able to say, I know you asked, how would I do this? But actually, this is how I've actually done it. That then shows an interviewer really quickly, wow, okay, not only are you able to give me the theory, but actually you're giving me the evidence as well. So I think if you can steer it that way. And interestingly, one thing I found with interviews is, I mean, again, this depends on the interviewer, but actually getting an interviewer to ask at the end of the interview, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you'd like to share with us? Because I had a candidate that was so nervous once, he literally it was like pulling teeth. But once I said to him, is there anything you'd like to share? He was able to talk about something that he just couldn't work out how to shoehorn in to the interview. And I think if there's something you really want to share as a candidate that you haven't had a chance to in the interview because it's just not given you the opportunity, I wouldn't be afraid to say at the end, there's just one thing I really want to make sure that you understand about me and the way that I work, and then share that at the end if you haven't had the opportunity to do it during the interview.
Very nice advice, like that. That's great. Thank you, George. Any other questions or points people would like to make? We've got time for one more, I think. Ravi, I hope that helped, by the way.
I'm going to stop sharing.
It did. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
Great question. Well, perhaps we've reached the point where we can say thanks ever so much to George. George, that was great. Really appreciate you doing that. Network members, so lovely to see you. We've got a bit of a sort of break in terms of events because, well, I think everyone's going to lunge for the bucket and spade, and quite rightly too. We still have the Friday feed coming out, but we're back in September with face-to-face events. We'd love to see you then. For now, George, thank you so much for doing that. Keep sharing on the WhatsApp groups, everyone, and we'll see you again very soon. Have a good summers, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank